Sierra Canyon, of how nature requires nothing of us. You take a walk out in any of these canyons, and there's nobody out there that's irrigating or weeding or pruning. Nature has a way of taking care of itself. And so what we try to do in permaculture landscaping is we try to create those kinds of systems. Did you have a question?
Yeah, could we give a URL for the site link so that people can actually...
So if you go to, if you Google Arizona Public Media or Google water harvester, you'll find the video. It's really engaging, and I hope you'll take a moment to listen to it sometime. Yep, here we go. So what I want to talk to you about is why landscaping matters, why we should care, especially as we hear more and more about drought conditions at Lake Mead and Lake Powell and the rapidly diminishing levels of that water. How we can make a difference both in our own yards. You can see this is kind of geared towards residential, but it applies to your larger common areas as well. How we can make a difference by just doing some simple things. And then how we can make a difference in our communities, as well as some resources that are available. So my goal when you walk away from this presentation is that you leave inspired. So my experience is that when we hear the environmental conversation, we tend to hear the doom and gloom. And there's certainly scary things that are being reported. But what I hope you'll leave with is that there are things that you can do that can make a huge difference. And I hope you leave understanding that we don't have to give up a speck of beauty in our landscaping in order to make these changes. I'm going to give you some strategies that you can use, and then I want you to leave that encouraged that knowing that we can each make a difference if we do just a bit. So why does landscaping matter? How many of you have ever seen pictures? This is Tucson, if I can point it out. This is a mountain right here. This is the Santa Cruz River. How many have ever seen pictures or realized that the Santa Cruz River used to flow perennially? So this was from back in 1904, but even as late as the 1920s, there was still perennial flow in the Santa Cruz River. This is what's happened to the Santa Cruz today. Same A mountain, Santa Cruz River, and it's bone dry. Now to Tucson's credit, they are taking steps to put effluent, recycled water, back into the Santa Cruz and try to restore year-round flow. There's also an organization in Tucson that's working on the feeder creeks that feed into the Santa Cruz by getting them healthy, trying to get the Santa Cruz to flow again. But my question to you is, what happened that caused this? Now, it's much more complex than my simple explanation is going to give you. And I'm not a hydrologist, but in broad brush strokes, what's happened is that we've started to treat rainwater as a nuisance rather than as a resource. So this is what we do typically in our buildings around Green Valley. If you see the blue arrows, can you make those out? Okay. What I've done is I've demonstrated how the water is flowing on this property. So if I can get up here without tripping, there's a downspout here. The channel was dug so that the water goes where?
Into the street.
Straight out into the street, okay? This is another community that will remain nameless in Tucson, or in Green Valley, excuse me. Here, we've got a downspout. The water is going underground, and it's coming out here through this pop-up emitter straight to the street. So at least on the other property, the water was at least touching the landscape. Here, not a drop of it, other than what falls out of the sky, but not a drop from that roof is falling on that landscape. It's going straight down the street. Now, what happens when we use our streets as storm drains? This is what happens. We get flooding because the streets are fine most of the year, but during the heavy monsoon rains, they don't have the capacity to keep up with it. And then all that water requires more maintenance of our streets. So we, the homeowners, or we, the taxpayers, are the ones that are paying for those repairs. So instead, let's look at just a little bit about some water consumption. This comes from wateruseitwisely.com. I don't know if you're familiar with this website. Lots of great information. This little infomercial or infographic comes from them. So again, we're not talking community-wide, but if you added all this water up from each of the individual residents here in Villas East, you'd see that this, even on a residential scale, makes a huge difference, but imagine on a community scale. So let's look. The little bottles of water represent a gallon of water. This is average water use in a household of 2 people. Or excuse me, this is 1 person, okay? Average has now come down. At the time of this infographic, it was about 120 gallons per person per day. It's, the good news is the average has come down to about 83 gallons, so we're being more conscious of the water we use. But look where the water's going. So it's not that it's unimportant to care about our water use indoors, but notice that if we, this is 11 gallons for faucets, so we could care about our faucets, but in the bigger scheme of things, our daily use, that's not a whole lot of the big picture. But 65 of those gallons, or 56% of our water use, is going outdoors. So we have an opportunity to make a major impact in how we landscape simply by how we manage our water outdoors. And in an average year per household, this adds up to 24,000 gallons. So imagine if you expanded that to a community scale. I don't know how many households are here in Villas East, but that's an enormous amount of water. So now I would like you to hear from Brad, and I want to talk to you about one of the easiest ways and most effective ways that we can make a difference in our landscape.
Something that frustrates me to no end is how folks say, there's hardly any rain in my community of Tucson or most desert communities, where in fact the case is that there's a lot of rain. In fact, in Tucson, Arizona, more rain falls on the surface area of this community in a typical year of rainfall than the entire community consumes of municipal water in a year.
Did you catch that? Isn't that astounding? There's more rain that falls here than we consume. Okay. So we've got a major opportunity.
Is that with or without the mines?
That's consumption, residential consumption. Yeah. Agriculture is the #1 user of water here in the state, followed by other industrial uses and residential use.
So I like to illustrate the potential with this little model. So here we've got about a 4,000 square foot urban lot, about a 1,000 square foot house upon it, and what happens when it rains on the typical Tucson lot? Well, here comes the rain. What's going on? Where's the water going? Out of here! Okay, we get this free high quality water falling from the sky, and what do? We get rid of it. I hate that. So, what if we were instead to harvest the water? Typically when people think of harvesting water, rainwater, their mind goes to tanks. So let's say we put in two 1,700 gallon tanks for a total of 3,400 gallon capacity. We're not kidding around with rain barrels, these are real tanks. So here comes the rain, let's see what happens now. Tanks are full! Alright. So you probably saw we still lost a good deal of water, but we have 1,700 gallons of water here and another 1,700 gallons here for a total of 3,400 gallons of sweet high quality rainwater that otherwise would have been lost. Okay? But you've most likely noticed that we still lost a great deal of water that was flowing off the landscape. That's what people all too often don't see. So how do we capture that water on the ground level? With the sponge. Okay? So let's put in two sponges. Now, in the landscape, these would most likely be water harvesting earthworks or rain gardens with sponge-like mulch and vegetation, living pumps of vegetation. So now let's see what happens when we rain on this setup. Here comes the rain. Tanks are full. It's a big old storm, which I love. Okay? We're still losing some water, but nowhere near as much as we did in the previous two scenarios. And the great thing is, while we lost some water to overflow, we captured the majority of the flow. So, how much of the flow did we get? Well, let's see. Here is 1,700 gallons. Nice. Here's another 1,700 gallons. Sweet. Okay, so where my pinky is, that is the level of the water that we caught from those rainwater tanks. So that is awesome. That's water we otherwise would have lost. But what about the sponge? Let's see how much we got there. Oh yeah. Way more. And that's just one sponge. What about the other? Nice. Yeah. All right. So there, my pinky is where the volume of water caught from the cisterns was. But here, look how much more we caught from the sponge. So the take-home message here is while tanks are a fantastic strategy to harvest the rain, don't overlook the soil. The soil is our largest and least expensive tank. The key is, how do we get the water into the soil? By creating bowl-like earthworks that infiltrate the water, put in a sponge-like layer on top that quickens the rate at which it enters the soil and decreases the rate at which it is lost to evaporation. And then plant living pumps so the trees can tap that water, draw it up into their tissue, and the water that's in the ground becomes water and fruit and shade and shelter, wildlife habitat, and so on.
So now you understand why I wanted you to hear from Brad, because he can say things much more engagingly than I. He's quite the character. So, as I pause to show you, more rain falls on southern Arizona than we currently consume. So we've got an opportunity to make use of that. So theoretically, we could replace our entire consumption with rainwater. I'm here not to necessarily advocate that, but what I am here to advocate is that 56% of our water usage that goes to landscapes can absolutely go away when we make use of rainwater. So, you'd have to multiply this by many homes in Villas East. But in Brad's example of a 1,000 square foot home with a 4,000 square foot lot, that adds up to 6,500 gallons of rainwater in an average year.
16.
Say again?
16,000.
16, thank you. 16,500 gallons in an average year. In larger homes, around Green Valley, that can be closer to 36,000. And again, you've got the cumulative effect of multiple residences here in Villas East. And so what I want to show you is most people think that the only way to have a low water use landscape, they refer to it as xeriscaping, xera meaning dry landscaping, is this before property on the left. We think that that's what our landscapes have to look like in order to be low water use. That we use lots of gravel, a few boulders, and throw in some cactus and call it a day. Now there's nothing wrong with that, but a landscape can be much more when we introduce or welcome the rain into the landscape. This is the after. And what we did in this landscape is we terraced that hillside with a series, remember Brad talked about bowl-shaped earthworks. We created a series of terraced swales going down that hill. So as the water flowed down the hill, it would go from basin to basin to basin. Now the landscape is so lush you can hardly see those swales in there any longer. And then we planted it with native plants that are adapted to go between our monsoon seasons. Okay. So this doesn't work, unfortunately, not that you necessarily have to give up your roses or citrus or those kinds of high water use plants, but it's extremely effective when we use native plants that are adapted to our soils and adapted to our climate. Okay. So remember again, with permaculture, we want to make use of nature, not ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist and then wonder why we struggle so. I'm going to pause here because I'm going to show you some ways to do this, some more ways to do this water harvesting, in-ground water harvesting. They refer to it as rain gardens or passive water harvesting. As compared to active water harvesting, capturing in tanks. But before we go on, let me just see if there's any questions real quickly. Okay, awesome. Then let's talk about rain gardens and how they would apply both on smaller scales around your properties as well as on a larger scale around the villas. So if you remember, Brad talked about how the soil is our largest and least expensive tank. Because whereas it would take, if you had 16,500 gallons of rainwater coming off of a property in a year, a little 25-gallon rain barrel is nice, but in the bigger scheme of things, it's not helpful. And in order to do that, you have to have the gutters and downspouts to capture that in the tank in the first place. So it requires some infrastructure. But anyone with a shovel, or that can hire somebody, if we're at the age where we can't quite dig that soil ourselves, hire somebody with a shovel, can do rainwater harvesting basins. And that's why Brad says it's our largest and least expensive tank. Because a single simple basin can hold thousands of gallons of rainwater. And you saw that in his example with the sponges. Okay. So what we're talking about is, and I love this quote, a simple depression that becomes a watery oasis every time it rains. So now instead of having that water flow away, we certainly don't want that water to pool around the foundation of a house, but between the house and the street, we have plenty of opportunities, or the building and the street, depending on where you're using this, there's plenty of opportunities to create those depressions to capture rainwater. So you see in this picture, I really like this picture, because a lot of people think that capturing rainwater requires big trenches, ugly trenches, or big pits in your yard. And we're talking about something simple and gentle, just enough to allow the water to stop and soak in. So the basic principle is this. If you remember the house where the water was coming from the downspout and was going down the hill towards the street, what they've done here is somewhere along the way, they've created that basin or depression to capture that rainwater. And then we always allow for overflow, because if we have such a heavy rain and that basin's not large enough to capture that rain, in most cases it will, but if you remember, any of you were here, what was it? I think it's been about 5 years ago when they got 5 inches of rain in Amato in 45 minutes. So that basin wouldn't hold all of that. So you want to have a way for it to overflow, not back up towards the house. And what I find is those beautiful changes in elevation add interest to a landscape. So I'm going to show you some more pictures, but this is from Brad. You can see the gentle changes in elevation from basin to basin. And then areas for berms for plants that wouldn't like their roots down in the bottom of that basin.
Charlene,
Makes sense so far? Yeah.
may I ask you to close those shades? I think it might help highlight the screen.
Sure.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Maybe we
Oh,
could open the door.
good, thank you.
The door?
Door, yeah.
Yeah. Does this window
I
open?
tried, I couldn't do it.
And for any, I don't remember many hills here in Villas East. It's pretty level here. Am I correct, or are there any slopes areas?
Montellana is up pretty high, and we've got two streets that when it's monsoon, they're like rivers.
Leave it open?
And in each of those, we have a traffic circle, which with a grassy area in the middle, and aside from the cost of regrading it, I don't see any reason why we can't make a depression in the center of that area to trap water.
You can, and I'm going to show you on a larger scale in a moment a picture. When this is done on a larger, more commercial scale, they refer to it as green infrastructure. And Tucson's been quite innovative in that, because Tucson has begun to recognize how much it's costing them in street maintenance to continue to use their streets as storm drains. And so they're now encouraging people to capture that water on their properties, both homes and commercial properties. But we'll get to that in a moment and address Glenn's. But if you have any sloped areas, this is what we did in that one picture that I showed you that had the steep slope. So the beauty of all of this is, if done properly, you don't have to haul soil in and you don't have to haul soil out. So what was done here is a swale was dug coming down the hillside. The soil from that swale created a berm, and then a second swale and a second berm. So you can imagine, this is why you don't need big deep trenches. Because for just a gentle, say 6-inch deep swale or basin, combined with a 4 to 6 inch high berm, now you've got 10 to 12 inches of capacity to hold rainwater. And you get those beautiful gentle changes that add interest to the landscaping. So I'm going to show you some pictures. Again, most of these, my work is residential. So most of these are residential examples, but again, these concepts can be used on a larger scale. So in this property, can you see the white downspout over to the side? So you can imagine in that flat property, every time it rained, that became a muddy mess. Now the downspout is slightly different angle, but it's just out of the picture. We created a meandering dry creek bed. Again, you see very gentle slopes, and that it's capturing the water from that downspout. What I want to draw your attention to is that those pictures were taken a year apart. Notice how much lusher everything looks just by having access to that rainwater. This was a project that Brad did in a this is a co-housing facility up in Tucson. So this would probably be more similar to the kinds of things you would do, but a sunken garden can be very effective. Okay? So that's what you were hinting at, Glenn, creating sunken areas that allow the water to infiltrate. This is another sunken garden on a residential scale. So if you and your home were around your home were trying to capture some rainwater, sometimes a sunken garden can work really nicely. And you just need to go 4 inches deep, not very deep, just enough so that the rain stays in around the plants. If any of you have been at Desert Meadows Park, we use a swale along the rainwater, in the rainwater garden. So what was happening in Desert Meadows Park, if you recognize the park, this is the Anza Trail over here. A brae goes off in this direction, and the slope was in this, towards the Anza Trail. So again, the Anza Trail was becoming really muddy every time it rained. Now that water is going into this swale, and the plants were brand new. I need to go out and get a new picture. They're about 3 years old now, and they are beautiful and full and lush thanks to that rainwater now. So things grow quickly with rainwater. And I want to show you that this can be done in small areas. So you don't need massive space to have this be effective. So this was a small townhouse off of Camino del Sol. They had one little planting area like this on one side of their backyard, another on the opposite side, and the whole rest of the backyard was those brick pavers. Because in a small yard, you need space to entertain and have your dining tables and your barbecues and all those things. Tiny space, but those gentle basins, that was taken right after a rain, and we always design the basins so that the water infiltrates in 24 hours or less. So we're not trying to hold the water and keep it there. We want it to soak into the soil. We don't want to breed mosquitoes. We don't line the ponds with plastic. We're not trying to create a pond. We just want the water, the rainwater, to have an opportunity to soak in. So let me set this up because I'm going to let you see rainwater harvesting in action. So my client was nice. He went out as it was raining, took pictures of the rain going from one basin to the next. Remember, we talked about how we try to attend to overflow. If one basin's too big, where does the water go from there? So you'll see that happening. His property's in the foreground, but as you watch, this is a real short video clip, which is why I'm setting it up. Watch the neighbor's yard just behind. Watch what's happening in the neighbor's yard. Did you see it? Yep. So his water was going from basin to basin to basin. Look at how happy and healthy those plants are. The neighbors, can you see it going straight down the street? There we go. So before we move on, are there any questions about the basins themselves, or the rain gardens, is what we refer to them as well?
In this type of soil that we have in Villas East, and the water is going to be coming down, how far horizontally will it tend to move in this type of soil that we have? So let's say you have a 6-foot diameter pond, or not pond, but a swale. How far horizontally on all sides will that water help?
So it's dependent on the volume, and there's people that, I work on a residential scale, there's people that do this on a commercial scale, that would calculate how much water is flowing and what number of basins need to be dug.
But generally, does it go straight down, or does it go off to the side?
Okay, great question. So when they dig something that goes straight down, there's sometimes where the space is so tight that they put in a French drain. You know what I'm talking about? That's dug deep and it allows the water to infiltrate and keeps it from often backing up to a foundation of a house when you have a tight space. But most of the time, if you've noticed these basins, they're gentle and broad as possible as space permits. Because you don't want them deep, you don't want them to be trip hazards. Notice that they weren't lined with rock for the most part. Rock may have been used as accents, but generally these basins are much easier to walk on than the typical drainage channel filled with river rock. Does that answer your question?
No, but I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
You know, many of these units here, we've got water that runs off the sheds or from the pump outs and everything else. When those come down off the roof, and it's a multitude of water that comes off the roofs, there's no way of catching that, and they're running through the sidewalk and really don't expose themselves to any plant life or anything else. What's your suggestion for something like that? Because I mean, tons of water come off the roofs.
So great question. He was talking about lots of water coming off the roof in areas where there's not an immediate opportunity to capture it. Do you remember very early on, I was showing you pictures of what we typically do, and one had a downspout and it had a big yard and the water was coming down the yard and there was lots of room to capture that water. But do you remember the second picture where the water was coming off the roof and they used underground PVC to get it to the street? We do that all the time, but instead of taking it to the street, we take it to somewhere where we can actually use that water. PVC is very inexpensive. There's adapters that go, that can be connected to a downspout. So they're rectangular on one side to fit into the downspout, and they're round on the other side to fit into the PVC. And it just takes you just need to dig a little bit to get the PVC up underneath wherever it needs to go. Believe it or not, it's pretty easy to take it under a sidewalk. So if you've got a sidewalk that's blocking where it's coming off a roof and where you need it to be, then they have a tool that gets up underneath the sidewalk and allows them to install the PVC up underneath. Okay. Anything else? Then let's look at what the plants that are important for rain gardens. Because remember, if we want this to be low maintenance, and most HOAs don't want to spend lots of money on landscape maintenance. You want things to look really nice, but to be cost effective. And the way to do that is we do that with native plants. Surprisingly, the average landscape is planted 80% or more with non-native plants. We've come from other parts of the country where we're used to certain things. We bring those with us when we come, and then we try to make them work here. And then we wonder why we have to fertilize all the time, or water all the time, or trim them back all the time. Our native plants, like I indicated earlier, are adapted to our soils. They're adapted to our monsoon conditions. So they've got adaptations. For example, the ocotillo is a great example. The ocotillo and many of our plants are what are called drought deciduous. So we think of deciduous plants that lose their leaves in the wintertime when it gets cold. But our native plants will often lose their leaves in May and June, or other times of the year if we have drought conditions. They'll drop their leaves to protect themselves. They don't need as much water, and you get a little bit of humidity or rain, and out they leaf again. So our native plants can often bloom periodically throughout the year, providing interest year-round. So I've only given you 5 plants here. There are 4,000, almost 4,000 native plants to the Sonoran Desert. So there's lots to choose from, and they're beautiful plants. So what I've got here is Arizona yellow bells. I don't know if you've seen this, large shrub, great for larger areas around the community. A wonderful shrub. It does lose its leaves in the wintertime, gets beautiful yellow-orange leaves in the fall, and has those berries that birds love. And then really easy to care for, penstemon, and in the background desert marigolds. Put them in the ground and forget them. Coming around, a wonderful shrub. So what we plant a lot around here, it's native to the Chihuahuan desert, so it is well adapted, but you see it everywhere, and that's Texas Ranger. Texas Rangers are a great plant. People like them because they're evergreen. They don't lose their leaves during the year. They have beautiful purple flowers, but only for weeks during monsoon season. And the rest of the year, all you see is the leaves. Dahlia, bush dahlia, is similar. It's from the Sonoran Desert. It keeps its leaves year-round, just like the Texas Ranger, so it's a great alternative if you want something different and unique. But it will bloom prolifically from early spring into the fall with those wonderful purple flowers. And then a hummingbird favorite down at the bottom, Registecia. So the great thing about our native plants, the great thing for us is they're easy to take care of. Once they're established, usually they need very little care. But the other great thing about our native plants is they're really critical to our native species of birds and butterflies and pollinators. So you're not only bringing enjoyment and ease to yourself, you're helping our native wildlife species, and you get the enjoyment of watching them. Who doesn't like watching birds and hummingbirds flit around, or butterflies flying around our plants? So I'm going to show you a few pictures, but the secret sauce, if you remember Brad mentioning mulched basins, is that what I do is I add mulch, usually in the form of large wood chips, to the bottom of the basins. So we've got about a 6-inch deep basin here, wrapping around here, kind of a crescent-shaped basin. By the time we've gotten 4 inches of mulch in, again, you can hardly tell that the basin's there. Once those plants fill out, because this was right after the landscaping project was finished. It wasn't even a year old, it was months old when that picture was taken. Once those plants fill in the basin, again, usually you can hardly tell that they're there. So before we go on and talk about anything else, I want to pause here and see if you have any other questions about plants, appropriate plants for that.
I don't remember, how high will the Texas Ranger grow and how wide?
So the Texas Rangers, there's a different species. So the traditional Texas Ranger can get as much as 8 feet in diameter and 6 to 8 feet high. But there are other varieties of Texas Ranger that don't get more than about 4 foot by 4 foot. So you really need to know what you're buying before you buy them and put them in. Because if you want low maintenance, you don't want to be pruning all the time. And landscapers are usually not trained in proper pruning, so they shear them back. That's right. But what that does is they lose their protection from our heat, and they start looking really scraggly and unhealthy. When left to themselves, Texas Rangers can look really beautiful, but in most landscapes they look terrible. And it's a matter of knowing how big it's going to get when you buy it and giving it enough space to grow. Plant, yeah.
Charlene, could you recommend good websites for us to go to regarding these plants that you just showed here?
I have a list of resources, but to answer your question immediately, my favorite website for information on plants is from Spadefoot Nursery.
Spell it, please.
Spade is just like a spade that you, SPADE, and then foot, all one word, nursery.com. And the reason I like that is that the husband and wife that own the business are horticulturalists. And they provide lots of information about plants. I mean, you could get lost, if you're a plant lover, you could get lost looking at all the information.
Another question regarding,
And then I see your hand,
Yes.
I'll get to you.
once the swale is completed with mulch, does it require remulching as time goes on, or does it take care of itself with dead leaves and the rest of it?
Great question. So we wanted to know if you need to replenish the mulch. And it's gonna depend on how you landscape. Because mulch, wood chips are an organic material, and they do break down over time. So they will eventually break down and go back into the soil. Rather than having your landscape crew come with their noisy electric blowers and blow all that wonderful free mulch away, if it is raked back into the basins, you shouldn't have to replenish again, or very minimally topping them off.
Two things. First of all, we used to live in Buckeye at one time. Avondale Water Company used to put out a wonderful brochure with all of the plants by shrubs or plants or trees, the sizes, the temperatures, everything.
Yes.
Secondly, the desert marigolds, which I love. We had some beautiful ones, but apparently the landscapers must have sprayed. And of course, that ends them. They don't grow well from seed. They're very difficult to buy locally other than Tohono Chua. And so what do you do to propagate? There's a couple of them that I'd love to dig up growing along La Cañada. But other than that, we should see a lot of them in our community, and we don't.
So that was a multi-factor question. Since most of us have no access to Avondale's plant list, I'm gonna give you some resources that can give you the same information if you wanna know more about plants. My resource list is at the end, and I can also email that to Glenn if you guys wanna get a hold of that. And then the second part of the question is about desert marigolds. There are native plant nurseries, they're in my resources, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a few minutes when we get there, that do sell our native plants. The local nurseries are great, but the local nurseries and many of the larger nurseries, and certainly the big box stores, are trying to appeal to a broader audience. And so they feel compelled to carry many non-native. They may be desert adapted plants, but they're not native to the area. And so if you have the choice of a Australian desert plant and a Sonoran desert plant, the Sonoran desert plant has so many advantages over the other desert plants that are brought here. So just because it's drought tolerant, just because you see it in your neighbor's yard, just because you see it at the nursery does not mean that it's native to the Sonoran Desert. You have to ask. One more thing, and then, because I was answering her questions about the desert marigolds. So there are native plant nurseries that do sell those.
Yeah, the only place I found them so far is Tohono Chua.
Yeah. You can usually find them in Spadefoot and Desert Survivors, and we'll talk about native plant nurseries in a moment.
We tried a test area with some native flowering plants, and the next day they were all gone. Rabbits or javelinas or something.
Yeah, there's a trick to seeding, for sure.
But we had transplants that were watered and whatever.
Yeah. So the one thing that you are probably gonna need to consider, because we're sharing so much of Green Valley with wildlife, is sometimes some chicken wire needs to be put up around the plants temporarily while they're getting established. It's often not the plant itself that they're after, it's often the moisture from the irrigation. Yes.
We're big fans of Desert Meadow Park, and I have to tell you, you can go there. They have them potted up. It's a great way to help support the park. That's where
Yes.
I've been buying my plants. They do very well here because they're only potting things that are healthy and are for this area. So your first stop should be Desert Meadow if
It
you wanna
is.
see what they have as far as the selection, which is usually quite large.
And a
Yes.
lot of
So-
cactuses, unfortunately.
Yeah, a lot of cactus because they're easy to propagate, and a lot of times they're cactus that propagate quickly. So, again, I'd encourage you to learn about the plant before you buy them. They do have wonderful plants, and I'm a Green Valley gardener and a huge fan of Desert Meadows Park and their work. But know the plant before you bring it home. Is it gonna produce bazillions of pups that in your tiny space you're gonna have to clean up all the time? Is that cactus gonna get way too large? Some of those plants get 8 feet or more. You bring the tiny little guy home and you think that's it, and before long, you've got something larger than you need. But I thank you, that's a great suggestion.
To follow up on this lady's question, is it the spraying of pre-emergent that stops the desert marigolds from propagating?
Yes, it will.
Is it stolen or that they spread by
No,
underground?
they reseed.
They reseed.
Yeah. And they're an important source of seeds for finches, so if you've been buying finch food, which can be really expensive, desert marigolds are a great way to do that. But yes, if you're trying to fight off other weeds, and you're spraying pre-emergent, it's gonna kill the good plants with the bad plants. It can't distinguish a weed from a wildflower. So we've spent most of our time looking at passive water harvesting, because like Brad said, that is our least expensive, easiest, most effective way to capture rainwater. But there are situations where actively capturing rainwater can make a difference. So you don't have individual pools, I'm gonna just skip through there, but for people that have individual pools, pool covers are really important to help reduce evaporation.
We have pool covers.
You have pool covers? Awesome, good for you. And a community pool is a wonderful way to have a pool, rather than every single person having their own pool that gets used maybe a few times a year, but uses as much as a single household would. So an average sized pool can use 24,000 gallons of water. So if you've got a 24,000 gallon a year household, your water consumption instantly gets doubled. So congratulations for doing that, and for having a community pool so that you can enjoy that without everybody having to have a pool. But there are options, or there are times when actively capturing rainwater is the way to go. One of those is for a pool or hot tub. One of the advantages of using rainwater for those kinds of things, as well as a water fountain. If you have a water feature, using rainwater can be very effective. And it's because rainwater is soft water, unlike our hard groundwater. So our mineral-laden groundwater, if any of you have ever had a fountain or water feature, you know that you have to scrub those minerals off all the time. You don't have that issue with rainwater. In a hot tub, it's beautiful to soak in that soft water. And if any of you ever had grandmothers that used to save rainwater to wash their hair, it's for that reason. It leaves hair feeling very soft and skin feeling clean. And when it needs to be used for plants, plants love rainwater. There are minerals and nutrients in rainwater that really help the plants grow. But what I want to show you is some ways to make a difference in the community. So the first is to talk to your landscapers the next time they put a plant in. Have them consider where the rain's coming, where the water's coming from, and might they dig a little basin for that plant? So you don't need to necessarily start by creating basins throughout the entire your entire community. Start plant by plant. So ask your landscapers to learn about this. Right now, there's no landscapers in Green Valley that are doing this. There's lots in Tucson and they don't want to come here. They've got enough work up there. It's not that they don't like Green Valley, but
We want to keep the riffraff out anyway, that's right.
Now, since I'm speaking to an HOA, this may be a sensitive subject, but I encourage homeowners to lobby their HOAs to allow rain tanks. I don't know the requirements here, but what happens a lot is a homeowner wants to put in their own little rain tank at their property, and the HOAs make it so difficult. They don't want anybody to see them, they have to be hidden, they have to be, you know, not more than a certain height. If you need a rain tank in a small space, it has to be high enough to capture enough water, because remember from our examples, 25 gallons is nice, but in the bigger scheme of things, it's not really gonna help you with your water feature. You need a big enough tank to capture enough water for your water feature, for example. And this is what I wanted to show you that would be very effective here in the villas, especially in your central areas. So what Brad's known for, Brad Lancaster that you heard from earlier, is he's known for his stealth operation of cutting the curbs in Tucson. He decided that if he went to the city of Tucson and asked permission to capture street side runoff, that they'd probably say no, they wouldn't understand what he was doing. So he decided that what he would do is he'd do in the weekend where there are no city workers out to catch him, and he cut the curbs so that the water as it flowed down the street could come into those curbside basins. He wanted to create a demonstration area so that when he went to the city, he had a fully grown system showing how effective this was. Well, now his entire neighborhood is using this strategy, and the city of Tucson is actually incenting people to do this.
Yes.
And in new construction, they're requiring that these curbside basins be part of that. That commercial properties now are required in the city of Tucson to keep 80% of their rainwater runoff on site.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So they refer to this on a larger scale as green infrastructure. It works really well in parking lots. If you've ever been to the Sprouts parking lot, look the next time you go. The water is flowing from Duval Mine Road towards the buildings. And so on the Duval Mine Road side of the planting medians, they've cut the curbs so that the water as it flows down from Duval Mine Road towards the buildings can go into those planting medians. And then if it gets so full, it just comes back out. That's what happens here. And we'll fill this up. If the basin can't hold it all, then it continues down the street to the next curbside basin.
Great.
Okay?
Great.
So here in the villas, what you'd have to do is observe, and it sounds like you've already done that, observe where the water is coming from so that the cuts on the upslope side, and then just have, then it will just flow out if it gets too full. And that is an extremely effective way to provide water for plants. It filters pollutants from the streets as it goes into the soil. And this was just an example of an entire community that used retention basins, and you're seeing that again more and more around Pima County, where retention basins are used to capture rainwater. So this is what I want to leave you with. As we wind up, these are the resources that I mentioned to you. Now, Brad Lancaster's 2-volume book on rainwater harvesting for dry lands and beyond is probably way more than most of us when it's not, you know, just casual bedtime reading. But if you really want to get serious, that's kind of the Bible of rainwater harvesting. It was the book that he wished that somebody had written for him when he was doing all this, that he had to learn the hard way.
And that is available at the Pima County Library.
Yes, it is. Yep. I mentioned Watershed Management Group that's doing a lot of work with rainwater harvesting throughout southern Arizona. And the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension also has books on rainwater harvesting, as does, I do classes for Ollie on rainwater harvesting. Then some demonstration sites. So this is Dunbar Springs. If you Google Dunbar Springs, it will come right up in Google Maps. It's down near the university. And you see, I wish I'd put the before picture in there because it was truly barren. There was hardly a thing growing in that entire neighborhood. And now it's beautiful and lush, thanks again to water captured in these street side basins. It's a public street, so anyone can go and walk up and down the street. And Brad and his neighborhood, because he eventually got the whole neighborhood involved in this project, they put interpretive signage. So if you want to understand why they did what they did and how they did it. Watershed Management Group, that property is now off the water grid. They're capturing so much water in cisterns. Now, that's not practical for the average person, but they're capturing enough water to supply all of their water needs, in addition to capturing water in the soil with basins and making use of the gray water that comes from their sinks and laundry system. So they have you just walk it's a self-guided tour is what it is, and they're on Dodge. And then you can go over to Desert Meadows Park if you haven't been to the Rainwater Garden. That's our local example. And that's the end of the presentation. So any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You know, many of us here have plants in our courtyard, et cetera.
Have
Okay.
plants, I'm sorry?
In our courtyards.
In your courtyards.
Right. And the question I have is when you experience in HOAs that are turning their heads to having a water harvesting system behind, is it simply a matter of aesthetics? Is that what it is?
That's what it is. So he asked us, the reason HOAs don't like rain tanks, is it aesthetics? And the answer is yes. I wish I could tell you that there's anybody that's manufacturing beautiful rain tanks right now. But they were designed originally to capture or to store water from like wells. And so they were designed to be functional. Sometime with enough demand, that might change. They can be screened with beautiful decorative metal. They can be painted with murals. If the space permits, vines can be grown on them, an evergreen vine. So there's ways to screen them and get around those things, but yes, it's aesthetics that is the concern, yeah. I'll keep
The
coming
question I
around.
have is, if we were to put tanks in, let's say the HOA approved that, and it seems to me the problem is the expense of watering these grass circles, and to drive by and you have a golf cart that has a tank on it, and pump them out of the people's places, and then drive around the deal and do all of that, is that gonna be cost prohibitive and actually go?
Yeah, you're gonna have to capture rainwater in a much larger scale. So when you buy rain tanks, just so you understand, the larger the rain tank, it is more expensive, but it's less expensive per gallon. So if each of you bought small rain tanks, you could buy a much larger rain tank for a lot less money than each of you buying small ones. So, but there's engineering concerns. You've got to have the downspouts, you've got to direct that water somehow and be able to use it. It can be hooked up to an irrigation system, but having somebody that works on a commercial scale that can help you with that is what you need.
Charlene, do you know of any HOAs that have engaged or used now a tank system, a harvesting system? Any examples?
Not here in Green Valley. And so, I just really applaud you that you're exploring these options for yourself. Even if nothing happens immediately, as the drought conditions continue at Lake Mead, it's only a matter of time before landscape watering is restricted. We're the only state that's not restricting landscape irrigation. And so thinking ahead and planning ahead is really important.
There's a formula that determines how much rain falling on a roof you can collect.
That's
I don't know it offhand, but but it's astounding how much rain you can collect off a roof.
Right. Well, and that was that example I gave you in the beginning of Brad's 1,000 square foot house. A 1,000 square foot house is pretty small, especially if you're considering that would include any garages or carports and patios. So the house itself would be tiny. But 16,500 gallons in an average year is a lot of rain. But you don't want a 16,500 gallon tank. Because the water doesn't come all at once. That would be a waste of money. So there are formulas, like you say, what percentage, what's the ideal, optimal size of tank to capture that, so you're not getting too much and you're not losing too much.
When he asked for an example of another HOA and you said not here in Green Valley, what's the closest one to us?
So that Milagro co-housing community, which was built, I think, back in the 80s or 90s, and Brad was really involved with the design of that. They actively and passively capture rainwater there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just east of here, or west of here, I was looking for a garage sale. I came upon a couple that must have had 7, 8 tanks. It was well done. I wasn't even really aware that they had them, but they gave me a tour of them, and I'm just trying to remember where it was.
Yeah.
But so people
There's
are doing it.
Yes, there's many individual residences that are actively capturing rainwater. But I think the question was there an HOA
Right.
that was doing that? And not at this time. And the disclaimer I need to say about Milagro is that it was built that way from the ground up. So all that was planned in. And so you have other considerations in retrofitting your area. And commercial projects are beyond my capacity, so you would need to consult with someone that could help you if you want to explore that in more detail.
In regards to native plants, there is a native grass called buffalo grass, not the buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is invasive. Buffalo grass is native. It has been around here for many years, and from what I have read, it takes so much less watering. We water our Bermuda grass here multiple times a day, and with buffalo grass, the amount of water that we need to keep our large trees alive would be plenty for the buffalo grass. Right now, we're watering for the trees 3 times a week.
So first of all, this is not about irrigation, but I would encourage you to go to the cooperative extension. If you're watering trees 3 times a week, you're watering too much. You're watering incorrectly.
Yep.
So
We're watering 7 days.
they have an irrigation chart. Now you have to water in the summer almost daily the grass. But trees don't need to be
But buffalo
watered.
grass, you don't, do you?
That's correct. If done properly, if the tree has a depression that captures rainwater, and if the grass is planted in that basin or well, then they should eventually be able to be taken off of irrigation and irrigated only in drought years. Buffalo grass is a beautiful native grass. It doesn't grow very high, so it usually doesn't need to be mowed. I use it a lot with homeowners that have small dogs that want a green area for their dogs. Like Bermuda, it goes dormant in the winter. And so it would be green from spring through fall.
Do you know of any place in the area where buffalo grass is planted so that we could actually go and see how it looks? I've been told it's not as aesthetically pleasing as the Bermuda.
I don't have any place that I know of that a large group of people could go to. But that said, you can find some nice pictures online.
Would Brad know of an area?
No, I don't know.
It doesn't handle a lot of foot traffic well, though, does it?
Like in
No,
a
it's,
common area?
no,
would there be
it's,
a lot of-
it's not as, so it would be in an area like those center planting areas where you're not walking all the time.
But
Or you
people
have
walk
to
their
create
dogs
walk
there.
paths for them, it's not as durable as Bermuda, you're correct.
Just to follow up on Brad Lancaster, there is, for those of us here, or those of you who have connection to the net, there's a lot of information. If you just Google Brad Lancaster, going back to his TED Talks, and so you get a lot of information just on all the stuff that's available under his link.
Right,
It's great, yeah.
Yeah,
Just a comment on buffalo grass, that's a clump forming grass, it's not one that spreads out like our common grasses, so it's really not that great for a high use area, like where everybody's walking their dogs.
Right,
It
that's-
just
that's-
doesn't work.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
a native prairie species.
yeah, that's
And the
exactly
Midwest.
what I was saying, you're correct. It would be more for areas like in your center
Right.
roundabout areas where it doesn't get a lot of traffic. It's a thinner grass, so if you compare the leaves of the buffalo grass, it's a thinner grass. So it's more like rye, it's much more like rye in its appearance. And it's a very soft, it has a pleasing appearance, but it's not as thick and sturdy, and it doesn't have the stolons that Bermuda grass does. So in high traffic areas, you'd almost need a walk path of some sort.
But didn't you say if you planted it around the trees, then eventually you don't have to water the trees as much?
Well, no, what would keep the trees from needing to be watered would be if you create a basin around the trees. If
Okay.
you cut the curbs or created a basin to allow the rainwater to soak in around the canopies of those trees.
So if we had a system of walkways through the circles, the big circles, would there be enough grass with buffalo grass for the dogs to do their duty?
Or you can plant as much or as
Yeah.
little as you want.
But it's also not
This
real
lady in
shade
red, I
tolerant.
think, has been waiting for a long time, I'm sorry.
It's not shade town.
And then I'll get back to you.
Open grass.
I'm gonna go back around to the water harvesting. We were the people that had the rain barrel that got voted down because of aesthetics. I wanna pass around some pictures of what our rain barrel looked like, and then what is legal here. And I would encourage people to let our HOA realize that aesthetically, there is nothing wrong with this rain barrel, especially when you look at what is legal. I'm gonna start passing it on. And then I'm gonna pass around my phone with a video, because we had to take it out so you can see a video of what it looks like when we don't harvest. And it's just on a loop, so you can just pass it as you go.
And the one
Want the
thing I'll
phone
say
back?
is the other thing that happens a
Okay.
lot with rain tanks, she was talking about the aesthetics of rain tanks. The plastic can be painted, you have to put a primer on it, but it can be painted just like downspouts and gutters get painted with colors so that it blends in against whatever it's up against, so that's another way of kind of disguising them.
So you don't do large-scale work, and we are a large-scale project.
That's correct.
How, just sort of thinking, visioning, how would you see this place being transformed from what it is now, which is basically what it was in 1964 when it was put together, you know, big areas of grass and eucalyptus and lepo pines and things like that, with huge amounts of water, $100,000 a year. Could I ask the question, please? Thank you. Could I just ask the question? Thank you. I realize you all want to talk, but I'm asking a question. How would we do that over the long term in this place? How would you see it developing here? Obviously, we don't have the kind of money to just hire a landscaper and do a massive transformation here. How would you see this place proceeding?
So great question, and my recommendation would be exactly what I encourage my homeowners to do, and that's to create a master plan. Work with a landscape architect that can help you create a vision for, and maybe it will take 10 years or more to implement, but to come in and change everything all at once can sometimes be very cost prohibitive. But once you have a master plan, that enables you to then get bids from contractors and start making decisions about what would be the most effective things that you can do in the short run. Because I bet you'll find many areas of kind of low-hanging fruit where you can spend a little bit of money and make some major differences. But you really need somebody who knows this business, a landscape architect, that can come in and make recommendations. A good landscape architect will listen to the community. They don't come in and tell you this is what you have to do. They spend a lot of time listening to what's important to you and then helping you come up with a master plan.
Thank you.
Now in the back, where we have all the spouts coming down, it's funny, they planted the lowest water use plants there instead of something that would consume more of the water, and you could put your bowls around it.
Yeah.
So it, permission to remove some of that stuff, which is absolutely colorless anyway, other than green and cacti, would be very beneficial.
And that would be a discussion with your HOA.
We have such limited area in the backs of these units.
Right.
Very tiny, and that's where the sewer runs, that's where the gas pipes run. So you really have to be cognizant of your area
That's
to plant
absolutely
anything
correct.
in there because of the infrastructure that's already in the ground.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
very
correct.
So
So you
the
need
plants
to
that were
work with
chosen were
somebody.
probably chosen because they're not deep rooted to go in and wreck the sewers and things like that. So that's some of the considerations, I'm sure, initially that were taken.
Yes, so again, if you're working with a professional, they would mark utilities before they design. They don't wait till construction. They design appropriately for the conditions. Yeah.
Just to comment on rain barrels, they're quite common in the Midwest, Minnesota, for instance,
Yeah.
actually funds rain barrels on an individual owner's basis. But in defense of HOAs, you also need a master plan that provides for a consistent color, if you will. Like ours are brown and green, you've got two options to choose from. But you also don't want a hodgepodge of somebody putting out, a wooden rain barrel, not covering it so that mosquitoes are getting in it, et cetera. So it needs to be taken on an HOA basis with some set of standards.
Yes, and those
to
would be
maintain
discussions
the-
you'd wanna have with your HOAs.
Right.
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
Aesthetics has come up multiple times, and I would like to just put out the idea that at some point, and I think this is part of permaculture, we may, as human beings, need to put nature's aesthetics before the aesthetics that we are familiar with.
Thank you.
We need to be adaptable, we need to be aware of how we are affecting nature, and possibly change our aesthetics that we grew up with, especially if we came from a different part of the country where those aesthetics do not apply.
Be ecologically minded
Yes.
instead of just worrying, because the backs of these buildings look like crap anyway. Am I right?
Just another question, and that has to do with the point that John raised regarding a master plan here. And it's gonna cost money if that's done. So I'm wondering, in your chats, your connections, if there's a sense that you might have seeing money coming down the line, federal funds, state funds, to help organizations like ours to achieve some of these goals.
There already are, and so I would recommend that you talk to your water company. I know Glenn's been in communication with Arturo Gabaldon
Yes.
and Community Water,
Yes.
and he can help connect you to what funds are available.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of funds, I don't know if people realize it, but our annual water and sewer bill for this community is about $125,000. Now, we just had a big raise in assessments. Cutting into that can cut into the amount of assessments that we have.
And so that's certainly there's certainly ways that you can easily and less expensively bring down your water costs. So exploring that in the long run, you're gonna to spend some money up front, but in the long run, there might be savings for you. And again, I'd encourage you to work with a good landscape architect that can help you with those. Do some consultations with several. Most will do a very, either an inexpensive or free consultation, and find someone that you feel is a good fit for the community that can help you with these decisions. A master plan does cost money up front. I know that I'm biased because that's what I do for a living on a residential scale. I help people with planning, but I believe that by planning carefully, in the long run, I help my clients save money and get what they want, not what somebody else thinks they should have. And that's what a good landscape architect will do for you. Well, thank you so much for having me. I truly appreciate it.
And thank you for coming out and spending your time here with us.
And thank you for grappling with these issues. You're the only HOA that I know that's really actively exploring what a difference that you might make and how you might make your HOA more beautiful for less money. So congratulations.